Ethan Richmond sat in the driver's seat of the wrecked SUV, staring through the frosted windshield at the swirling blizzard. He was 15, the son of one of the wealthiest men in the world. But in that moment, he felt nothing but helplessness. The world outside was a wall of white, the wind howling like some wild creature ready to swallow him whole. His father, Raymond, had been unreachable for hours. Ethan's phone, dead from the cold, sat useless in his pocket. His heart raced and his hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the terrifying realization. No one knew he was out here. No one would be looking for him until morning. And Ethan wasn't even sure if he'd make it that far. The crash had been sudden. One moment, he was driving down a snow-covered mountain road with the heat blasting, listening to music. The next, the tires had slipped, sending the car skidding sideways and flipping into the trees. Ethan had somehow managed to unbuckle his seatbelt, but the rest of his body felt numb, frozen even. The weight of the night was pressing down on him, the bitter cold biting into his bones. He had no food, no water, and worst of all, he was alone. But then, through the dense snow and swirling darkness, he saw movement, like a shadow passing through the storm. A figure appeared in front of the windshield, coming closer, walking against the wind. Ethan blinked, trying to make sense of the blur. The person was just walking, in nothing but a tattered jacket, with wild, unkempt hair and no shoes. Ethan's heart skipped. His first thought was that it was a mirage. Someone from his dreams, someone he imagined would come to save him. But no, the figure was real. The girl didn't hesitate as she approached, her boots crunching on the snow. She stopped when she saw him, kneeling down beside the wrecked SUV. A pair of piercing brown eyes locked with his. Her lips were cracked and pale, but her voice was clear as she spoke. "You stuck?" Ethan swallowed. His voice barely came out, rasping with fear. I don't know how to get out of here. My phone's dead. I can't get in touch with anyone." She studied him for a moment, her gaze calculating. Then, without saying a word, she reached into her coat and pulled out a small, barely there blanket. She didn't hesitate before wrapping it around him. "You're gonna freeze if you stay like this." Ethan's lips parted, but no words came. He was frozen, his mind racing to make sense of this encounter. Who was this girl? How had she ended up out here? In the middle of nowhere, when even he, who had everything, could barely survive in this storm. "Come on," she said, grabbing his arm and tugging him from the wreckage. "You don't have much time. Get moving." He could barely think, could barely comprehend. Here he was, a millionaire's son, about to be dragged through a snowstorm by a homeless girl he'd never met. But as the snow whipped past him and his legs struggled to keep up, something within him started to shift. The cold was no longer his biggest enemy. "I'm Cassie, by the way," she added, pulling him along. Ethan didn't answer. His thoughts were consumed by the chaos, by how he had ended up here, by how, in this moment, the person who seemed to be the least equipped to survive was saving him. "Ethan," he said quietly, finally finding his voice. "Ethan Richmond." She didn't look impressed, but she didn't need to be. Cassie didn't care who he was. She only cared if he could keep up. As they trudged through the snow, the winds howling louder, Ethan's thoughts flickered back to the life he had left behind, the life he had never quite fit into. Wealth and privilege had always defined his existence. His father, Raymond Richmond, had built his empire from the ground up, teaching Ethan to value power, control, and success above all else. But it was never what Ethan wanted. He couldn't remember a time when his father had truly seen him. To Raymond, Ethan had always been a reflection of his own success, a prize to show off, a mark of his hard work. But deep down, Ethan knew that he was never more than a shadow of his father's achievements. He never realized how little he truly knew about the world until now. The wind biting into his skin, his frozen fingers numb from the cold, and Cassie, a girl who had learned to survive without any of the comforts he took for granted, became a mirror reflecting everything he lacked. As they walked further into the storm, Ethan's mind began to spin with questions. Who was Cassie? How had she ended up here, alone in the snow, when he could barely survive in a car crash? And why, in this moment, was she the one saving him? As they walked further into the storm, Ethan's mind began to spin with questions. Who was Cassie? How had she ended up here, alone in the snow, when he could barely survive in a car crash? And why, in this moment, was she the one saving him? His breath came out in sharp bursts, the cold air stinging his lungs. His body shivered, not just from the cold, but from the confusion gnawing at him. How had this girl, in nothing but a thin jacket and torn jeans, managed to navigate through a blizzard like this while he, wrapped in layers of designer clothes, was already struggling to keep moving? He glanced at her out of the corner of his eye. Cassie moved like someone who knew exactly what she was doing, her steps sure and confident as she carved a path through the snow. She didn't look back at him, but she didn't need to. She knew he was struggling to keep up. Ethan hesitated for a moment, his pride flaring up. This isn't how things were supposed to go, he thought. He was the son of Raymond Richmond, the one with the money, the status, the control. He wasn't supposed to be relying on a homeless girl to survive. But the cold was gnawing at him now, the snow biting through his clothes, and he didn't have a choice. No matter how much he wanted to shake off the feeling of weakness, he was cold, scared, and stranded. And the girl walking ahead of him? She was the only person out here who seemed to have a clue what to do. Cassie glanced over her shoulder, her eyes sharp. "You okay?" she asked, her voice steady, unaffected by the storm. It was the kind of voice that suggested she'd faced worse than this and wasn't intimidated by it. Ethan didn't know how to answer. He wasn't okay. He was freezing, and his mind kept racing, but he didn't want to sound pathetic. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice strained. "I'm fine." She gave a slight nod and turned back to the path ahead. "Not for long, you won't be," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for him to hear. "We need to get to shelter. Fast. The storm's getting worse." He wanted to argue, wanted to say that he should be the one leading, the one calling the shots. But she was already a few steps ahead, carving a trail through the snow. Cassie's confidence, her lack of fear in the face of something that was slowly freezing him from the inside out, made him realize that whatever was happening, whatever situation they found themselves in, she was in control. Cassie stopped abruptly, and Ethan nearly collided with her. She turned to face him, the wind whipping her hair into her face, but she didn't seem to care. "We're heading toward that stand of trees," she said, pointing ahead. Ethan followed her gaze, seeing a few dark silhouettes of trees barely visible through the blinding snow. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. "You don't have a plan, do you?" Ethan asked, the words escaping before he could stop them. Cassie raised an eyebrow. "You really think I'm going to leave you out here to die?" She didn't wait for him to answer. There's a cabin up ahead. It's been abandoned for years, but it'll keep us out of the wind." Ethan bit his lip, still skeptical. He had no idea who this girl was or how she could know about a cabin in the middle of nowhere. But he wasn't about to argue. "What choice do I have?" His teeth chattered as he nodded, reluctantly falling in behind her. Cassie didn't speak again for a while, and neither did Ethan. The only sound was the wind howling around them and the crunch of their footsteps in the snow. His fingers felt numb, and his body was beginning to stiffen with cold. Every time he tried to push ahead, he stumbled, and Cassie had to stop to let him catch up. It was humbling, and he hated it. But Cassie, for all her gruffness, never seemed to lose patience. She just kept moving, keeping a steady pace that was somehow both fast and measured. She didn't seem to care how rich Ethan was, or how much better his life should have been. She just focused on surviving, like she had done for the past 2 years. Ethan couldn't stop himself from asking, even though part of him knew it was rude. "How do you know this place?" Cassie glanced at him again, this time her gaze colder, harder. "Lived here long enough to know what's worth knowing," she said simply. "You'd be surprised how much the world forgets about places like this." Ethan frowned, trying to make sense of her words. "How long have you been out here?" he asked, his voice quieter now, edged with curiosity. "A while," Cassie replied, her tone evasive. 2 years. Maybe. A little more, I don't keep track." His eyes widened. 2 years? He couldn't even imagine. 2 years on the streets, 2 years fighting to survive. Ethan had never had to worry about surviving. He had food delivered to him, clothes that never wore out, a house bigger than some small towns. Cassie? She had nothing. And somehow, that made her more equipped to handle the storm than he was. Ethan swallowed hard. He had no idea what to say. His life, as comfortable as it was, suddenly seemed so irrelevant in the face of this. "I'll get you to that cabin," Cassie said, her voice steady. "Just keep moving." He nodded again, not trusting himself to speak. He was just beginning to understand how little he knew about the world beyond his sheltered life. And Cassie? She was the one who was showing him the way. As they trudged through the snow together, Ethan had to admit something he'd been resisting all night. He was relying on her, and despite everything inside him that screamed to keep his distance, he didn't have any choice but to follow her lead. They began their journey towards shelter, Cassie moving with purpose, and Ethan struggling to keep up. Despite his pride, he was forced to rely on her. But the idea of trusting someone who had so little was hard to swallow. He couldn't help but wonder, who was she really? And what had brought her to this point? But for now, it didn't matter. He just needed to survive. The wind howled louder as they trudged through the snow, the storm now a relentless, suffocating force. Ethan could barely feel his fingers or toes anymore, the numbness creeping up his limbs with every step. Each breath he took seemed to freeze in his chest, and his clothes, expensive and designed for style, not survival, offered little protection against the elements. His jeans were soaked through, the fabric heavy and clinging to his legs. His jacket, though thick, felt like paper against the wind. Behind him, Cassie moved effortlessly, as if the snowstorm were nothing more than a mild inconvenience. Her thin jacket flapped in the wind, but she didn't seem to mind. The weight of the storm didn't even seem to register on her face. She just kept walking, her steps sure, her body low to the ground as she cut through the blizzard. Ethan's pride burned, a low, stubborn ache in his chest. He had always prided himself on his resilience, on his ability to handle anything that came his way. But here, now, in the freezing wilderness, it became painfully clear just how ill-prepared he was. He couldn't even keep up with Cassie, who had nothing but the skills and knowledge that came from years of survival. She had been living in the streets, enduring the harshest conditions imaginable, while Ethan had been protected from everything. Cassie noticed his struggle, her sharp eyes flicking to him briefly before she slowed her pace. Without a word, she pulled a worn, small blanket from her bag and wrapped it around him, securing it over his shoulders like a cape. The warmth it provided was a small relief, but it did nothing to erase the growing shame Ethan felt at his own helplessness. "Try to keep moving," she said, her voice calm, almost too calm for the situation. "The cold's not the worst of it out here. It's the wind. We need to keep moving." Ethan nodded, but his legs felt like lead. He pushed forward, trying to ignore the pain in his body, but it was hard to deny the deep ache in his bones. His chest tightened, his breaths shallow. A few moments later, Cassie stopped, her hand up. Ethan barely heard her over the wind, but she was looking ahead, scanning the horizon. "There," she said, pointing to a dark shadow in the distance. It looked like a pile of snow or a mound, but Cassie's eyes were sharp. "That's the shelter. We're almost there." Ethan didn't respond. He couldn't. He was too exhausted to speak, too cold to care. He followed her, one step at a time, his mind clouded with frustration and confusion. How had his life gotten to this point? How had he, with all the advantages in the world, ended up relying on a stranger, a girl who had nothing, to save him? They reached the shelter, a small, half-buried structure nestled between two large rocks. It was crude, made of branches and snow, with just enough space to curl up inside. It didn't look like much, but it was something. And at this point, Ethan didn't care what it looked like. It was shelter. Cassie immediately set to work. She gathered some dry branches and small twigs from the surrounding area, then crouched down to start a fire. It wasn't easy. The wind made every spark fight to stay alive. But after a few minutes of focused effort, the dry twigs caught, and soon a small fire crackled between the rocks. The warmth spread outward, and Ethan felt his muscles relax for the first time in what felt like hours. He sank down next to the fire, his legs stiff and sore. He didn't have much energy left to do anything else. He just sat there, staring at the flames. Cassie didn't sit. She kept moving, gathering more wood and working on the shelter, her movements efficient and practiced. Ethan watched her, feeling a deep, quiet awe stir within him. She knew what she was doing. She had a purpose. Everything she did was calculated, with no waste of energy, no unnecessary movement. She wasn't cold. She wasn't frustrated. She was focused, living in the moment and doing what needed to be done to survive. Ethan couldn't stop himself from asking, "How do you know how to do all this?" The question slipped out before he could stop it. "I mean, you've been on your own, right?" Cassie glanced at him, her face expressionless, then went back to her work. "Yeah, 2 years now. Maybe more." She paused, her hands stilling for a moment. Then quietly she added, "I didn't have a choice." Ethan didn't know how to respond. He wasn't sure if he should push her to explain further or leave it alone. But Cassie seemed to sense his hesitation. She stopped what she was doing and sat down beside him, pulling her knees to her chest, her eyes focused on the fire. "My mom died from cancer," she said, her voice soft but steady. "We didn't have the money for treatment, and she got really sick really fast. I was just a kid. I didn't understand. But when she died, my dad, he couldn't handle it. He lost his job, he started drinking, and he just didn't care anymore. I ended up in foster care, one home after another, never finding anything that felt like home. She took a deep breath, as if the words had come harder than she expected. Ethan didn't know what to say. His own life, his own problems, seemed so trivial in comparison. He had never once worried about where his next meal was coming from or whether his father would be there for him. He'd always had everything he needed, even when he didn't want it. "And then you ended up here?" Ethan asked, his voice thick with a mix of sympathy and curiosity. Cassie nodded slowly. "Yeah, ran away from the last foster home. They were using the money for themselves, not taking care of us. I didn't have a choice. So I ran, and I've been out here ever since, surviving." Ethan didn't know what to say. He couldn't even imagine her life. But for the first time in his life, he felt the weight of what real survival meant. Not surviving in a mansion with everything handed to you on a silver platter. Not surviving in a world where money could fix anything. But real survival. The kind where every day was a fight. Cassie's gaze softened slightly as she looked at him. "You're lucky," she said, her voice surprisingly gentle. "You're just scared. You haven't had to survive. You'll learn. You'll be okay." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, feeling both embarrassed and in awe of her. He didn't want her pity. He didn't need it. But he couldn't deny how her words cut deeper than he expected. He wasn't ready to accept it yet. But in that moment, he realized something that unsettled him. He wasn't prepared for the world outside of his father's mansion. And Cassie, despite everything she had been through, had managed to survive without a safety net. He looked at the fire again, watching the flames dance and crackle. He realized, for the first time, how much he had taken for granted. Ethan, still cold and uncomfortable, sat by the fire, trying to warm his numb fingers. Cassie had taken charge, using her knowledge and experience to keep them both alive. But as he sat there, he couldn't shake the frustration building inside him. He'd been given everything, yet here he was, struggling just to survive. Cassie, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the skills she'd learned the hard way, had already proven she was more prepared for the world than he was. And that thought, those words, stuck with him more than anything else. The wind had quieted, but the snow still fell heavily, coating the world in white. Inside their makeshift shelter, the warmth from the fire was a small comfort, but it didn't reach the cold that had seeped into Ethan's bones. He sat with his back against the cold stone, staring into the flickering flames. His mind kept racing. How did I get here? He kept asking himself that same question over and over again. Cassie sat a little ways off, sharpening a stick into a crude spear. Her focus never wavered, her eyes steady, but Ethan saw something different in her now. It wasn't just survival that kept her moving. It was the way she moved through the world, resilient and unbroken. She didn't have anything to protect her from the cold, the storm, or the harsh reality of the streets. But she had something Ethan couldn't quite define. It wasn't just the will to survive. It was the understanding that survival wasn't enough. The crackling of the fire filled the silence for a moment, and Ethan finally broke it. "Do you ever get tired?" His voice came out quieter than he intended, the question surprising him. "I mean, really tired of everything. Of living like this?" Cassie didn't look up from her spear, but she stopped what she was doing. "You mean surviving?" Ethan nodded, biting his lip. Yeah, I don't know if I can keep doing this. Out here, in the cold, with nothing. He gestured to the shelter, the fire, the snow falling outside. I can't even feel my fingers, Cassie. I've never been this helpless. Cassie didn't say anything at first. Her expression softened, the hardness in her eyes fading just a bit. She sat back on her heels, the stick still in her hands, and let out a long breath. Yeah, it gets old, all of it. But you keep going because if you stop, you die. Her voice was matter of fact, a calmness to it that Ethan couldn't quite place. Out here, in this storm, you can't afford to stop. You have to keep moving or you'll freeze. You have to keep your head in the game, even when it feels like the game's rigged against you. Ethan looked at her, feeling something stir in him, something raw and unfamiliar. She had no safety net, no mansion to run to, no father who would pay for everything to make life easier. And yet, she moved through the world like it was nothing more than a challenge to be faced. "What's it like?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. "Living like this? I mean, you've been on your own for so long. How do you do it?" Cassie looked at him for a long moment, her face unreadable. She seemed to weigh the question, like she was considering how much to reveal. Finally, she dropped her gaze to the stick in her hands and began to whittle it down further. "It's not about doing it. It's just about surviving. You don't think about anything else. You don't think about the past, about what you don't have. You just focus on the next moment." She looked up again, her eyes sharp. "That's how I made it. I don't get caught up in what I don't have. I just get by with what I do." Ethan swallowed, processing her words. "I don't get it," he admitted. "I've never had to think like that. I've always had people taking care of me. I don't know what it's like to really fight for survival." Cassie's lips tightened. "Then you're lucky. But it doesn't last forever. Everyone's going to hit a wall. The real question is, what are you going to do when you do? When the wall comes, you can either keep running into it, or you can learn to climb over it, break it down, or just go round." Ethan thought about his father, about Raymond Richmond, the man who had everything. The man who had been the one constant in his life. But not in the way that mattered. Raymond had built his empire from nothing. He was always striving for more, never content with what he had. He had worked hard. Ethan had to give him credit for that. But his father's definition of success always left Ethan feeling like he was just a shadow in his father's world, someone to be groomed, someone to be molded, someone who was never truly seen for who he was. "I'm not like him," Ethan said abruptly, surprising himself. "My dad. He wants me to be just like him. He's always pushing me to be something I don't want to be. I don't even know who I am anymore. He thinks that if I follow in his footsteps, I'll be happy, but I'm not." His words tumbled out in a rush, frustration rising in his chest. "I hate it. I hate being trapped in his world." Cassie's eyes softened, though she still didn't say anything for a while. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm but firm. "Then stop living in it." She paused, her gaze steady on him. "You don't have to follow in his footsteps. You don't have to live his life. If you want to know who you are, you have to stop listening to him and start listening to yourself." Ethan exhaled, his breath fogging in the cold air. He wanted to argue, to say it wasn't that simple. But Cassie's words lingered in his mind, a quiet challenge to everything he had been raised to believe. She was right. He had spent his whole life trying to live up to an image of success that wasn't even his own. Maybe that's why he'd always felt empty inside, like something was missing. Because everything he had was just given to him. A pre-built life that didn't truly belong to him. I've never had to think like that, Ethan said quietly, his gaze fixed on the fire. It's always just been there. My dad's money, his expectations. It's always been about him, what he wants, what he needs. And I've just followed along. He looked up at Cassie, something shifting inside him. I don't even know who I am without all that. Cassie gave him a small, knowing smile. You're learning. You'll figure it out. For the first time since the storm had started, Ethan felt something other than frustration. He felt something like respect. Respect for Cassie. Respect for her strength, her resilience. She had survived everything life had thrown at her with nothing but her wits and determination. She had built her life from the ground up, with no handouts, no safety nets. She wasn't perfect, and she didn't pretend to be. But there was something deeply admirable about the way she fought for her life. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was filled with something unspoken, something that was starting to form between them. They were two people from different worlds, yet in this moment, it felt like they understood each other more than anyone else ever could. Cassie stood up, wiping the snow from her jacket, and turned toward the shelter's entrance. We need to keep moving, she said, her tone gentle but insistent. The storm's not done with us yet. Ethan nodded, still feeling the weight of their conversation in his chest. He stood up too, his legs still stiff from the cold. But now he felt something else, a flicker of clarity. Maybe he didn't have all the answers. Maybe he didn't know exactly who he was or what he wanted to do. But for the first time, he realized he didn't have to live his father's life to be worth something. And as they stepped back into the storm together, Ethan knew that, for better or worse, he was starting to find himself in ways he never expected. The wind had picked up again, howling with a fury that rattled the walls of their temporary shelter. Ethan sat by the fire, his mind spinning in circles, still processing everything that had happened. The frustration, the self-doubt, the growing respect for Cassie. He was exhausted, his body stiff from the cold and the constant motion, but he couldn't sleep. Every time his eyes closed, his thoughts would race back to the conversation he and Cassie had shared. She'd opened up to him in a way that no one had ever done. And for the first time, Ethan felt like he might be able to survive this storm, maybe even learn something about himself in the process. But suddenly, the sound of the wind changed. It grew louder, more insistent, like a deep, rumbling growl from the earth itself. Cassie, who had been sitting by the fire, instantly went still. Her eyes narrowed as she listened to the sound, her body tensing. Ethan's stomach dropped. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the rising wind. "Get up," Cassie ordered, already standing. "We need to move, now." Ethan didn't argue. He stood quickly, his body stiff and uncooperative, and followed Cassie as she moved toward the entrance of the shelter. The storm outside was blinding, the snow falling in thick, horizontal sheets. But Cassie's movements were quick, calculated, like she was preparing for something. "What's going on?" Ethan asked again, his breath coming faster now, a tight knot forming in his chest. "Don't ask questions, just follow me," she said sharply. She grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the door, the wind lashing at their faces as soon as they stepped outside. The world was a blur of white and gray, the snow swirling in violent gusts. And then, The ground beneath their feet shifted. A deep rumbling noise echoed through the mountains, so powerful that it almost felt like the earth itself was shaking. Ethan froze, the realization crashing into him a heartbeat too late. "Cassie, what's happening?" "Avalanche," she said, her voice steady but urgent. "It's coming. We need to move. Now." Before Ethan could react, the ground beneath them cracked. The snow, already heavy and unstable, began to slide down the mountain with terrifying speed. The roar of the avalanche filled the air, drowning out everything else. Cassie grabbed Ethan by the arm and yanked him forward, pulling him away from the shelter as fast as she could. The force of the snow began to push them, dragging them both toward the edge of the mountain. Ethan's legs faltered, his footing slipping in the thick snow. He could barely hear his own thoughts over the deafening roar of the avalanche behind them. Cassie shoved him harder. "Don't look back! Keep moving!" But it was too late. In the split second that Ethan turned his head, the avalanche hit, a wall of snow and ice crashing down on them. The ground beneath their feet disappeared, and the snow began to consume everything. Ethan felt his body jerk forward, his feet slipping out from under him. He tried to grab onto something, anything, but his hand closed on nothing but air. He was falling, sliding down with the snow, his body weightless, completely at the mercy of the mountain. And then, through the blur of snow and chaos, he saw Cassie. She was ahead of him. But the force of the avalanche was stronger than either of them had anticipated. Cassie was pushed to the ground, and in the split second it took for Ethan to reach her, he saw her body disappear beneath the snow. "Cassie!" Ethan screamed, his voice lost in the roar of the avalanche. He scrambled forward, his heart racing, his mind screaming for him to stop, to move faster, to do something, anything. He found her, her body half buried in the snow, her face pale and frozen. The fear in his chest turned to pure panic. He dropped to his knees beside her, his hands shaking as he tried to clear the snow away. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow and weak. For a moment, Ethan was frozen, his thoughts a jumble of terror, disbelief, and indecision. He wanted to save her. He had to. But as the avalanche continued to rumble behind them, as the cold intensified, a horrible question ran through his mind. Can I save her? The snow around them was still moving, slowly settling in, and Ethan realized, with a sinking heart, that if he didn't act now, they both might be buried alive. Without thinking, he dug faster, his hands raw and freezing as he pulled at the snow, clearing a small space around Cassie. He could hear her faint breathing, the only sound that reassured him that she was still alive. His fingers were numb, his thoughts starting to blur, but he didn't stop. Finally, after what felt like hours, he managed to drag her out of the snow, her limp body heavy in his arms. His breath was coming in short, sharp gasps, the cold seeping deeper into his bones. He had to move. He had to get her warm. Cassie had shown him how to survive out here. She'd taught him what he needed to know. Now, it was his turn to use those lessons, to fight for her the way she had fought for him. His mind scrambled for the survival techniques she had shown him. A fire, shelter, heat. He pulled her behind a large boulder that had been spared from the avalanche. The snow was still falling heavily, but the wind had died down slightly, and there was a brief break in the chaos. He dragged branches toward him, trying to remember everything Cassie had done. He didn't have much, just the small kindling from earlier, but he worked quickly, gathering whatever he could. It took what felt like an eternity to get the fire started, but eventually The dry wood caught. The flames flickered weakly at first, then grew stronger as he fanned them with his hands. Cassie was still unconscious, her face pale and her lips blue from the cold. Ethan worked fast, pulling the blanket around her, wrapping her in his arms as best as he could, trying to share his warmth. As the fire crackled beside them, Ethan sat back, his body shaking, his mind numb with fear. He stared at Cassie, watching her slowly begin to warm up. He couldn't stop the thoughts that kept swirling in his mind. She saved me. She saved me when I couldn't even save myself. She pushed me out of the way, took the hit for me. And now, she might die because of it. Ethan felt a tight knot in his chest, a weight that seemed to press down on him with every breath. He had no idea how to explain what was happening inside him. The fear, the guilt, the overwhelming sense of helplessness. But one thing was clear. She had sacrificed everything for him. And now, he would do everything he could to make sure that sacrifice wasn't in vain. Cassie's breath was growing steadier, her body beginning to thaw from the frost that had gripped it. Ethan still watched her closely, his heart heavy with the weight of what she'd done for him. He didn't know how he could ever repay her, how he could ever repay someone who had given so much, without even asking for anything in return. But in that moment, as the fire crackled beside them, he knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't let her die. Not on his watch. The snow had slowed to a steady flurry by the time Ethan felt he could safely stop. Cassie's body was still cold, her skin pale and fragile, but she had stopped shivering. Her breaths were deeper now, the shallow gasps from before turning into a more regular rhythm. He had managed to keep the fire going, carefully feeding the flames as the hours passed. Ethan sat beside her, his mind spinning in circles. His body was still sore from the avalanche, his limbs aching from the constant movement through the storm. But the physical exhaustion didn't bother him as much anymore. What plagued him now was something deeper, something inside his chest that felt like it might break wide open. He leaned back against the rocks, staring at the sky. The night was a blanket of gray, the stars obscured by the thick clouds. For the first time since the crash, Ethan allowed himself to think about his life before the storm, before the avalanche. He could feel the weight of the memories pressing down on him, forcing their way to the surface. The images flooded his mind. His father's face, a permanent mask of control and disapproval. The endless meetings, the high-powered events, the lectures on success, on responsibility. You'll never be anything without ambition. His father's voice echoed in his head. Raymond Richmond had always pushed him, made him strive for more, but never once had he told Ethan that he mattered for who he was, not just what he could accomplish. Ethan thought about his father's mansion, his home, where everything was perfect in its own artificial way. Expensive furnishings, spotless floors, walls lined with trophies and achievements, but nothing real. No warmth, no love. Just the cold, suffocating weight of expectations. He'd never asked for it. He'd never wanted it. But somewhere, deep down, he had always felt like he wasn't enough, like he was living in a world where everyone else was real, and he was just a pawn in his father's empire. But here in the wilderness, amidst the chaos of snow and silence, Ethan finally understood something he hadn't allowed himself to before. The life he had known, the life built on wealth and privilege, was just a veneer, a mask to hide the emptiness he'd felt for so long. He hadn't had to fight for anything. His father had given him everything, yet it was never enough to fill the void inside him. Cassie, on the other hand, had fought for everything. She had survived a world that had tried to break her, and yet In all the years of struggle, she had never lost her humanity. She had never given up on kindness. That was something Ethan hadn't understood until now. "Cassie," he whispered, his voice breaking the silence between them. Her eyelids fluttered, and for a moment, he thought she might still be unconscious. But then her eyes opened, slowly, painfully, as if waking from some deep, restless sleep. Her gaze was unfocused at first, but it sharpened when she saw Ethan. "Hey," she said hoarsely, her voice barely audible. She blinked, taking in the fire, the shelter, the cold air around them. "What happened?" "You're safe," Ethan replied, his voice surprisingly steady despite the anxiety that had coiled in his chest. "We're safe, for now." Cassie shifted, trying to sit up, but Ethan stopped her gently. "You need to rest. You've been through a lot." Cassie gave him a sharp look. "What happened to the Avalanche? It's over. We made it out." Ethan paused, swallowing hard. "You saved me, Cassie. I wouldn't have made it if you hadn't pushed me out of the way." Cassie didn't respond right away. She closed her eyes, as if trying to gather her strength before looking back at him. "I wasn't thinking," she said, her voice raspy. "I just did what I had to. That's how it works, right? You survive by doing what's necessary." Ethan looked at her, still trying to process everything. He thought back to the avalanche, the chaos, the panic. Cassie had pushed him out of harm's way without a second thought, risking her own life for him. In the harshest of circumstances, when survival was on the line, she had chosen him. A stranger. The weight of it hit him again. How selfless she had been. How much she had given. She hadn't asked for anything in return, no reward, no thanks. She had just done it. And in that moment, Ethan realized just how much he owed her. "You don't have to keep doing this," Ethan said, his voice cracking. "You saved my life. I don't know how to repay you." Cassie didn't smile, but her gaze softened, the hardness in her eyes easing. "You don't need to repay me. I didn't do it for you. I did it because it was the right thing to do." Ethan shook his head, the words tangled in his throat. "I don't get it. You've been on your own for so long, and you're still so damn strong. How do you do it?" Cassie's lips parted slightly, but she didn't answer right away. Instead, she closed her eyes again, exhaling deeply, like she was summing up everything she'd been through. "You have to survive. That's all. It's not about being strong or being weak. It's just about making it to the next day, the next hour. If you let the world break you, you won't make it. If you keep going, if you keep your head above water, you'll find a way out. That's all I've ever done." Ethan sat back, the fire crackling between them. He felt something shift inside him, something deep, like the weight of 100 bricks lifting off his chest. Cassie hadn't just survived. She had fought to survive. And somehow, in all of that, she had never stopped caring about others, about doing the right thing. "I don't know if I can do what you do," Ethan said quietly. "I don't know if I can keep going like you do." Cassie's eyes met his, her expression softening even further. "You don't have to be me, but you do have to keep going. That's the only way out of here." Ethan's heart clenched, and for the first time since the crash, something inside him clicked into place. He wasn't going to let her die. Not after what she'd done for him. He had to repay her somehow. Somehow. He had to get them both out of this. "I will," he promised, his voice firm despite the fear that lingered in his chest. "I'll get us both out of here. I promise." Cassie nodded slightly, her expression unreadable. But Ethan could see something in her eyes. Something like acceptance. The storm outside had not yet passed, and their journey was far from over. But for the first time since he had been thrown into this nightmare, Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just here to survive anymore. He was here to make sure they both made it out. He didn't know how they'd do it. But he would do everything he could to keep his promise to her. The storm raged on outside, but Ethan knew something had changed within him. He had learned to trust Cassie, trust himself. And with that trust, he had made a promise to get them both out of the mountains, no matter what it took. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about doing what was right. The snowstorm hadn't let up, but the winds had quieted, leaving the air heavy with a strange stillness. Ethan and Cassie had continued their trek through the mountains, moving slowly but steadily. Despite Cassie's obvious exhaustion and the pain from her injuries, she insisted on pushing forward, her determination to survive as fierce as ever. Ethan, though still cold and tired, felt an unfamiliar strength within him now. He wasn't just walking to escape the storm anymore. He was walking with purpose. With each step, he understood more about who he was becoming. More importantly, he was beginning to understand the sacrifices Cassie had made for him, and what he needed to do for her. "I think we're getting close," Cassie said, her voice hoarse but stronger than it had been. She'd been listening to the distant sounds of helicopters for a while now, the faint whoop 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 of blades cutting through the air. Ethan looked up, scanning the gray sky above. He could barely see anything but snow and mist. But Cassie's instincts were sharp, honed from years of surviving in the wild. Ethan was still too distracted by his own thoughts to say anything. But when Cassie turned to look at him, he noticed the tiredness in her eyes. She wasn't as strong as she'd appeared. Not by a long shot. She was pushing herself beyond her limits, and Ethan felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He had promised her, promised himself, that he would get them both out of here. But now, as the helicopters grew louder, he knew the promise would soon be fulfilled. "Cassie," Ethan said, stopping for a moment to steady himself. "You should rest. I'll keep going ahead. We're almost there. The rescue teams are—" She shook her head, a grim smile forming on her face. "We're close, but not close enough. I'll be fine. Just keep going." Ethan hesitated, wanting to argue, but instead, he followed her lead. They both moved forward, forcing their aching bodies to ignore the pain, the cold, and the exhaustion that had begun to numb their limbs. The snow crunched beneath their feet, and the wind began to pick up again, this time carrying the faint but unmistakable sound of voices. As they crested the last ridge, the world around them changed. The mountains that had seemed so isolating suddenly gave way to a clearing. And in that clearing, the glow of searchlights pierced through the snow, illuminating figures in bright yellow jackets. Ethan's heart leapt in his chest. They had found them. They made their way toward the group, the sound of helicopters overhead growing louder. The search team was already preparing to help, scanning the area and looking for survivors. As soon as they saw Ethan and Cassie, several of the team members rushed toward them, their faces masked in shock and relief. "You two are lucky we found you," one of the rescuers said, his voice gruff but filled with genuine concern. "You've been out here longer than we thought." Ethan nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. His legs felt like jelly beneath him, but he refused to fall. He wanted to stay strong, wanted to prove he could survive. But in the presence of the search team, all his strength drained from him. Then, out of nowhere, a familiar voice broke through the noise. Ethan! Ethan turned around, his heart pounding. His father stood there, flanked by several other men in suits. Raymond Richmond, his usually composed face now full of emotion, moved toward him. The moment their eyes met, something passed between them, a mix of anger, relief, and confusion. "Dad," Ethan said, his voice barely a whisper, his heart thumping in his chest. Raymond stopped a few feet away, looking his son up and down, his gaze sharp and full of something that Ethan couldn't quite place. "Ethan, what the hell were you thinking?" Raymond's voice cracked, the depth of his emotion suddenly visible in the way his shoulders slumped. "Do you have any idea how worried I was? I told you to stay close. I told you to stay safe, and yet here you are in the middle of a blizzard, with nothing but a girl who—" He stopped, catching himself, but the words still hung in the air like a punch to the gut. Cassie, who had been standing quietly by Ethan's side, her face pale, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, suddenly stiffened. Raymond noticed her then, and his eyes flicked over her with an expression of disdain that Ethan hadn't expected. His father's gaze lingered on Cassie, and for a moment, the judgment in his eyes felt unbearable. But then, something inside Ethan snapped. "No," Ethan said, his voice stronger than before. "No, Dad, you don't get to do that." Raymond blinked in surprise, taken aback by Ethan's sudden outburst. Ethan stepped forward, putting himself between his father and Cassie. "This girl, Cassie, she saved my life," Ethan continued, his voice firm now, unwavering. "She gave everything to help me, even when she had nothing left to give. She's not just some girl you can look down on. She's a hero. And if you can't see that, then you've got no idea what real strength is." For a long, tense moment, Raymond didn't respond. His mouth opened as if he was about to say something, but he stopped himself. The anger and frustration that had been boiling in his chest suddenly felt hollow, like a distant echo. "You're right," Raymond finally said, his voice quieter, more somber than it had been. "I'm sorry, I should have never assumed. I'm just—" He stopped, as if searching for the right words. "I was just scared, Ethan. I couldn't lose you." Ethan looked at his father, really looked at him for the first time in what felt like years. There was no anger in his eyes anymore, only a raw vulnerability that Ethan had never seen before. In that moment, he understood something about his father that he had never truly grasped. Raymond had never been a perfect father, but he wasn't just the cold, distant figure Ethan had always resented. He had been terrified too, terrified of losing the one person who meant everything to him. But then, Ethan turned back to Cassie, who was still standing there, her gaze downcast, a quiet sadness in her eyes. Despite everything she'd done for him, she was still the outsider, still treated like an inconvenience by the people who should have been grateful. Ethan's chest tightened. This wasn't just about survival. It was about recognition. It was about treating people, no matter who they were, with the respect they deserved. "Cassie," Ethan said, his voice soft but resolute. "You deserve better than this. You've saved my life. You've done more than anyone could ever ask for. And I won't let anyone forget that." Cassie finally met his eyes, her expression softening just slightly. She didn't say anything, but the faintest hint of gratitude flickered in her gaze. Ethan looked back at his father. "You owe her an apology, too." Raymond stared at his son for a moment before giving a small, reluctant nod. His gaze flicked back to Cassie, and the apology in his eyes was genuine, even if unspoken. "I'm sorry," Raymond said quietly, his voice laced with the kind of humility Ethan had never thought he would hear. "I shouldn't have judged you." Cassie's shoulders relaxed, but she didn't respond. She didn't need to. The rescue team began to help Cassie with medical attention, and Ethan stood by, watching, knowing that their journey was finally over. But something within him had changed. His relationship with his father wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But Ethan understood now. And for Cassie, he'd fight for her recognition until the very end. The cold courtroom echoed with the sound of muffled footsteps as Raymond Richmond stood at the front, his back straight but his expression weary. The flickering fluorescent lights above did little to soften the tension in the room. Ethan sat behind him, his mind still reeling from the events of the past few days, the crash, the avalanche, the storm, and the rescue. It was all so surreal, like something out of a movie. But this was real. And now, everything was about to change. Cassie sat beside Ethan, her arms wrapped around herself, her body tense. She had been through so much, more than anyone her age should have to endure. And yet, here she was, sitting in this sterile courtroom, just a few steps away from Ethan's world. It felt like two worlds colliding. Her face was a mask of cautious hope. But behind her eyes, Ethan could see the fear and hesitation. After years of surviving on the streets, trusting anyone, let alone people like Raymond, was a leap that was almost impossible to take. The judge, a woman with a sharp gaze and a no-nonsense demeanor, flipped through a stack of papers in front of her. "Mr. Richmond," she said, her voice commanding but not unkind. "I understand you've come here today with a proposal regarding Miss Cassie's future. Please, proceed." Raymond straightened, his hands clasped in front of him, his jaw set with a quiet determination. The weight of the situation seemed to settle heavily on his shoulders. For the first time in a long while, Ethan saw his father not as the powerful businessman who ruled everything around him, but as a man faced with the consequences of his own actions. The last few days had chipped away at the cold exterior Raymond had built over the years. Raymond paused, clearing his throat. "I want to ensure that Cassie doesn't end up back on the streets. She deserves more than what the system has offered her. She deserves a chance." The judge raised an eyebrow, the silence in the room thick with anticipation. "And what exactly are you offering, Mr. Richmond?" Raymond's voice was steady but tinged with something like vulnerability, something Ethan had never heard from his father before. "I'm offering her a home, a family. I know it's unorthodox, but I want to bring her into our home, into my home. I want to give her a place where she's safe, where she's treated like a daughter." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He had always known his father had power. But this was something different. This was Raymond Richmond acknowledging his mistakes. He was seeing the world in a way that Ethan had never thought possible. Cassie's eyes flicked toward him. She looked conflicted, unsure whether she could believe his offer, or if it was just another hollow promise from someone who couldn't understand her life. The idea of trusting a stranger, especially someone like Raymond, felt impossible for her. The judge took a long pause, her fingers tapping gently against the desk as she considered Raymond's words. Then she spoke. "Mr. Richmond, your offer is unusual, but I must consider the best interests of the child. Miss Cassie has been through an ordeal. She's been failed by the system. She needs stability, and if you are truly willing to provide that, then we will need to see evidence of your commitment." "I understand," Raymond replied, his voice firm. I'm committed. I've already spoken to the necessary authorities. I'm prepared to offer Cassie everything she needs, and I'll ensure she has the opportunities she deserves." The judge nodded, then turned her gaze toward Cassie, her expression softer now. "Miss Cassie, you've heard Mr. Richmond's offer. It's not an easy decision to make, but it's a chance for a new life, for safety, for support. What do you think?" Cassie's eyes widened slightly, and for the first time in the past few days, Ethan saw a flicker of hope in her face. But it quickly faded, replaced by the familiar uncertainty that had defined her life on the streets. She looked away, her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her sleeve. Ethan leaned toward her, his voice low but earnest. "Cassie," he said, his words only for her, "you don't have to do this alone anymore. You deserve more than just surviving. You deserve a chance at something better. You fought so hard for so long. Please, let us help you." Cassie bit her lip, her gaze still averted. She had always been on her own, depending on no one but herself to survive. Trust was a foreign concept to her. The idea of letting someone, let alone Ethan's father, into her life felt like a betrayal to everything she had ever known. But Ethan wasn't just asking her to take a leap of faith. He was asking her to believe that things could be different, that she could have a family, a future. Cassie finally met his eyes, her gaze soft but full of hesitation. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. "I've lived on my own for so long. I don't know what it's like to have people care about me, to have someone expect something from me. I'm scared, Ethan." Ethan's heart ached as he listened to her. She had been through so much, lost so much, and now she was being asked to trust people she barely knew. But he couldn't let her back out. Not when he knew how much she deserved this. "You're not alone anymore, Cassie," Ethan said, his voice steady. "You've done more than anyone could ever expect from you. You've already survived against all odds. Now, it's time to let people help you, to let me help you. You deserve a better life, a real one, and you don't have to be scared anymore." The room was quiet as Cassie's eyes searched Ethan's face, her expression torn between fear and the hope he had sparked in her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she nodded. "I'll try," she said, her voice barely a whisper. But it carried the weight of a decision that would change her life forever. "I'll accept your offer." Raymond, who had been watching the exchange quietly, let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His face softened, and for the first time, Ethan saw him as more than just a businessman. He saw him as a father, someone who was trying to make up for lost time. "Thank you," Raymond said, his voice quieter than usual. "I promise you, Cassie, I will do everything I can to make sure you're not just safe, but happy." Ethan felt a shift inside him. He had always thought of his privilege as something tied to wealth, to status, to power. But now he understood. Privilege wasn't just about what you could buy. It was about having the choice to change your life. The choice to make things better, not just for yourself, but for the people you cared about. Cassie looked at Ethan, a small, hesitant smile tugging at her lips. I think I can trust you. I'll give it a try." As the courtroom emptied and the legal formalities continued, Ethan walked out alongside Cassie, her hand resting lightly in his. They were stepping into a new life, a life that had once seemed impossible. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt the weight of his father's promise settle between them, an unspoken bond that held the promise of a better future together. The sun streamed through the tall windows of the Richmond mansion, casting long shadows across the polished floors. It was a quiet morning, one that felt completely different from any morning Ethan had ever known. He sat at the large wooden table in the breakfast nook, his fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee. But his thoughts were far from the steaming mug in his hand. Cassie sat across from him, her face softer than it had been when they first met. She was no longer the same girl who had trudged through the snow, cold and lost. She was slowly finding her place in the Richmond household, not as an outsider, but as someone who had been given a chance. The scars of her past still lingered, but they weren't as sharp now. The weight of survival didn't press down on her as it once had. Ethan had always thought of his family's mansion as a gilded cage. Everything had been designed for comfort. Everything had been easy. But now, sitting here with Cassie, he saw it in a new light. This house, with all its wealth and privilege, was a place where they could begin again, where they could build something real. And for the first time, Ethan felt at home. "Cassie," he said, breaking the silence. She looked up from the cereal she was absent-mindedly stirring, her brow furrowed slightly. "Yeah?" she asked, her voice still uncertain at times. Like she hadn't fully accepted that she was allowed to be here. "I was thinking, I'm glad you're here," Ethan said, the words coming out more easily than he had expected. It was a simple sentiment, but it carried with it everything he'd learned in the past few months. Cassie gave him a small, genuine smile, the kind that only came from someone who had allowed themselves to start healing. "I'm glad too," she replied, her voice softer now. It wasn't the hard edge that had once defined her, it was something closer to hope. The door opened, and Raymond stepped into the room. He looked different, more relaxed, like the weight of his past decisions had begun to lift. Ethan had always seen his father as a man driven by ambition, a man who saw his success as something to be achieved at all costs. But over the past few weeks, he had begun to see Raymond as a father who was learning to be present, a father who was beginning to understand what it meant to connect, to really care. "Morning, you two," Raymond greeted them, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He didn't sit down at the table right away. Instead, he leaned against the counter, watching Ethan and Cassie with a quiet, almost admiring gaze. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You're actually smiling." Raymond chuckled, his voice gruff but warm. "I suppose I am. It's a new thing for me." Cassie, still a little shy, met his gaze. "It's good to see," she said carefully, as if still unsure of her place in this world that had once seemed so out of reach. Raymond nodded. "I wasn't exactly the father I should have been. I've spent too much of my life chasing after things that don't really matter." His voice softened, a note of self-awareness in his words. "But I'm trying to do better. For both of you." Ethan studied his father for a moment, seeing the man he had once resented in an entirely new light. Raymond's willingness to change, to admit his mistakes, was something Ethan had never thought possible. And it made all the difference. "You are doing better," Ethan said quietly, surprising even himself. It wasn't just about the money or the success anymore. His father had done something more important than all of that. He had started to listen. And for Ethan, that was more than enough. Raymond gave a small, appreciative nod, and then turned to Cassie. "And you, young lady, are a part of this family now. I'll make sure you're taken care of. Whatever you need, it's yours." His voice was serious, but there was a warmth in it now that hadn't been there before. Cassie hesitated, glancing at Ethan for a moment before meeting Raymond's gaze. She didn't speak right away. The offer, so generous, so unexpected, was something she hadn't known how to handle. For so long, she had been on her own, fighting for every scrap of survival. The idea of someone else caring, of being offered a real home, was still foreign to her. "I don't know what to say," she admitted quietly. "I've been alone for so long. I don't know what it means to be a part of something." "You don't have to say anything," Ethan said, his voice gentle. "You're already part of it. You're part of this family now. That's what matters." Cassie's eyes softened, a tear slipping down her cheek before she quickly wiped it away. "I'm not used to this," she whispered, almost to herself. Ethan leaned forward, his gaze intense. "I know, but you don't have to be. We're all figuring it out together." The room fell into a brief silence, the weight of their unspoken emotions hanging in the air. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt like he wasn't alone in this world. His father was trying, Cassie was healing. And for all the chaos and pain that had brought them to this point, they had found a way to build something new. Later that day, Ethan and Cassie walked together through the sprawling grounds of the Richmond estate. The sun was setting behind the mountains, casting an orange glow across the fields. Cassie, her shoulders now more relaxed, smiled as she walked beside Ethan. "It's peaceful here," she said, her voice low with wonder. "I've never been somewhere like this." Ethan nodded. "I never really noticed how peaceful it was until recently. It's like the storm is finally over. For both of us." Cassie looked at him, her expression serious. "You know, when I first met you, I thought you were just another rich kid who had no idea what real life was like. But you've changed, Ethan. I can see it. You're not who I thought you were." Ethan smiled softly, his heart swelling with gratitude. "I don't think I knew who I was either. But you've helped me see that I can be something different. Something better." They walked in silence for a few moments, their footsteps crunching in the snow. Finally, Ethan spoke again, his voice quiet but filled with certainty. "I never really understood what true wealth was until now," he said, looking ahead at the horizon. "It's not about money. It's about the relationships we build, the people we care for, and the sacrifices we make for each other." Cassie turned to him, a small smile on her lips. "Yeah, I guess we both learned that the hard way." Ethan nodded. "We did, but at least we're learning. Together." As the two of them walked back toward the mansion, Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of peace settle over him. The storm had changed them both. It had broken them down, but it had also rebuilt them. Stronger, more connected. And in that rebuilding, Ethan realized, they had found something far more precious than wealth or success. They had found each other. As they entered the warmth of the house, the world outside felt 1,000,000 miles away. And with that, the beginning of a new chapter in their lives started, one filled with hope, with family, and with the promise of a future that was no longer defined by the past. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe, like, and share for more.